There's so much confusion out there. It's unbelievable. And I just value people so much who bring clarity in moments like this. And our next guest is one of those men. He's an assistant professor at Kentucky State University. He's got 2 books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. Professor Wilfred Reilly. Mr. Reilly, how are you, brother?
Doing really well. Good to be on the show.
And I should note my favorite Twitter handle, WillDeBeast630. So you can follow the professor at WillDeBeast630. Professor, again, we're all confused. You have clarity. What is the number one thing that if you could just scream from the rooftops and get people to understand and see, what would that fact be?
Well, one thing I try to do as an academic is bring actual knowledge, numbers to the table to a lot of these debates that divide, say, whites and African Americans, the social classes, so on. So a lot of these things that we're seeing in society today aren't based, to me, on an understanding of reality. When we hear from the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a movement that's inspired by real belief, real passion, but some of these claims, like Attorney Crump's claim that there is a legalized genocide against people of color, that's absolutely counter to facts you can find out through academic study. If you go to the Washington Post police shootings database, for example, the total number of unarmed black men that were actually killed by law enforcement officers in the most recent year on record, that's 2017, was 15. The total number of unarmed individuals, period, of all races, the majority, as always, were Caucasian and Hispanic, that were killed by Leos was 56. Only about 1,000 people, armed or unarmed, and most of those were individuals with a gun or a knife attacking the officer, were shot or otherwise killed in interactions with police. 229 were African American. Even that slight discrepancy, we're about 15% of the population. We made up 22% of the shooting victims, goes away if you make a simple adjustment for crime rate. So understanding the actual facts, the actual realities that exist out there in the ether often really changes the debate around a lot of these social questions. And this gets into even more complex issues. For example, are gaps that we see in society due to, for example, institutional racism? Again, they're facts that have to be brought to the table before people can simply take an angry, opinion-based position.
Okay, all right. So before we even, I want to ask for an example of that and systematic racism and all the rest. But sure. As you're sharing this truth and these facts and wisdom, it's so contrary to every narrative that exists out there. Like, you must be so wildly frustrated when you're hearing all this and you're like, like, don't you guys know this? Like, what do your students think, right? Your students come into you probably more radicalized because of everything they're hearing in the culture. And then they come to your class and you share what you just shared with us, like their brains must explode.
Well, I've had great students. I've really enjoyed teaching at Kentucky State, which is, a top 200 university, historically black college. Teaching is a great thing to be able to do, to be blessed enough to do. But for me, again, I think definitely you do see an intense reaction to the actual facts often when they're brought to the table. And I think the facts around a lot of these issues surprise people. The entire idea that there's substantial racial conflict in the USA is not real. Something, you mentioned my Twitter handle, something that I gained a fair amount of attention for saying on Twitter is that violent interracial crime, at least between black and white people, is 5% of crime. And that's frankly not controversial. There were 12 million crimes on the record last year. If we're talking about violent crimes or serious property crimes, that's according to what's called the BJS report, the National Crime Report. And only about 600,000 of those involved violent encounters between blacks and whites. And that's individuals on either side attacking. And getting almost into taboo territory here, in a typical year, including last year, those incidents are going to be 70, 80+% black on white rather than vice versa. That's not even especially surprising. A glib one sentence is there are more white people and they have more money. But it certainly defeats the narrative that there's this epidemic of violence, Barbecue Becky and Pool Party Paula and Coupon Carl and Central Park Dog Gate and so on against African Americans. The reality is that this conflict between blacks and whites, two groups that get along rather well, believe it or not, that's 5% of crime and it's 80% B on W. So again, a lot of the actual facts here are dramatically counter to these narratives on the left, and I'll say dramatically counter to a lot of these narratives on the hard right as well, but the facts are as they are. The question that I have as someone who kind of gets paid as a political scientist to look into who presents narratives, is why do we believe so much of this nonsense? And I really do think the mainstream mass media has a lot of blame, a lot of water to carry here.
Slater Crusaders, thanks for watching the first on YouTube. If you want more, like, subscribe. We got plenty.